Letters from the past. Dust rose in columns through the October sunlight as I opened the door to Mom's attic. Eleanor Carter, 68 years old, and I felt like I was intruding on someone else's life, though that life belonged to my own mother. Mom died 2 weeks ago at 93, taking all her secrets with her, and Evelyn Carter had plenty of them. Even as a child, I sensed there was something unspoken in our house, important things that everyone kept quiet about. When I asked about family history, Mom would brush me off or change the subject. In her final years, as dementia began destroying her memory, she sometimes said strange things. She'd mention names I didn't recognize, cry for no reason, while looking at old photographs. The doctors explained it as the disease, but I always suspected that somewhere deep in her memory lay recollections she'd never dared to share. Now, going through her house in Providence, Rhode Island, I hoped to finally understand what this mysterious woman had hidden all her life. The house was full of memories, framed photographs, old furniture I remembered from childhood, books with bookmarks still in place. I'd already sorted through most rooms, packing things for charity or keepsakes. But the attic scared me. Mom had climbed up here less and less over the years, and hadn't been up at all for the last 15 years. When I was little, the attic seemed like a mysterious place full of treasures. Now it just looked dusty and abandoned. The wooden steps creaked under my feet as I climbed with a flashlight in hand. The electricity hadn't worked up here for years. The beam of light picked out the shapes of old furniture from the darkness. Boxes covered in cobwebs, a mannequin Mom used to use for sewing dresses. In the farthest corner, under an old patchwork quilt I remembered from childhood, sat a worn leather suitcase. My heart skipped. I recognized it. This was my grandmother Rose's suitcase, Mom's mother. Grandma died when I was 10, but this suitcase used to sit in her bedroom, and I often looked at the hotel stickers on it. Grandma Rose was an enigmatic figure in our family. She rarely spoke about her past, and Mom never told me details about Grandma's youth. All I knew was that she married Grandpa Frank in 1945 and lived with him until his death in 1982. The suitcase lock didn't give way easily. It had rusted with time and humidity. I had to use a screwdriver to pry it open. When the lid finally opened with a creak, the smell of old leather and lavender hit my nose. Grandma always put lavender sachets in her things. What I saw inside made my heart stop. Letters. Dozens of letters, neatly folded and tied with a faded blue ribbon. The same ribbon Grandma used to tie her hair with in her youth. I'd seen it in old photographs. Each envelope bore my grandmother's address, written in neat, masculine handwriting. Miss Rose Cohen, 1842 Hope Street, Providence, Rhode Island. And in the upper left corner, a return address that changed from letter to letter. Private James McCarthy, with various military postal numbers. My fingers trembled as I untied the ribbon. Who was James McCarthy? Grandma had been married to Grandpa Frank Miller from 1945 until his death. I'd never heard of any James. The first letter was dated September 20th, 1943. My darling Rose. I read the neat, masculine handwriting. I'm writing to you from training camp in Georgia. It's hot as hell here, and the sergeant yells at us from morning to night. But I think only of you, of your eyes, of your smile, of how you laughed when we danced that last time. Remember, you said you'd wait for me, no matter how long it took. Hold on to those words, darling. I'll come back to you. I swear. I read on, completely absorbed in this story. A world I'd never suspected was opening before me. My stern Grandma Rose, whom I remembered in black dresses with constantly pursed lips, had once been a young girl madly in love with a soldier. From James's letters, I learned the details of their romance. They met at a dance at the local community center in the summer of 1942. James was a tall Irishman with blue eyes and an infectious laugh. He worked construction in Chicago, but had come to Providence for his cousin's wedding. One dance with Rose changed all his plans. In his letters, James recalled every detail of their meeting. How Rose was shy about talking to a stranger. How he spent the whole evening convincing her to dance. How they talked until dawn, sitting on her front steps, while he told her about his plans to open a construction company after the war. How the next day he canceled his train ticket to Chicago and stayed in Providence. James found work at the local shipyard, rented a room from an elderly Irish woman, Mrs. O'Malley. For 3 months, he courted Rose with the persistence of a man in love. Walks along the waterfront, trips to the beach, picnics in the park. In his letters, he described teaching her to catch crabs, how they danced to music from the radio, how he read her Irish poetry. In a letter from October 1943, James recalled their engagement. He proposed right there on the waterfront, pulling a ring from his work jacket pocket. The ring was simple, a gold band with a tiny diamond, all he could afford on a worker's wages. But to Rose, it was more beautiful than all the treasures in the world. They planned to marry when he returned from the war. Rose was already eyeing a wedding dress in the shop on Main Street. James dreamed of a house with a white picket fence and roses in the garden. That's why he fell in love with a girl with that name. But in September 1943, James was drafted. In a letter from the same date, he described their farewell at the train station, how he held Rose in his arms until the final whistle blew, how he promised to write every day, how she stood on the platform waving a handkerchief at the departing train. The letters from fall 1943 were full of hope. James completed training in Georgia, then was sent to England to prepare for deployment to Europe. He served in the 101st Airborne Division, an elite unit that would participate in the most dangerous operations. In the letters from winter 1943 to 1944, the tone began to change. James wrote about the harsh English winter, about comrades who didn't return from training jumps, about his growing understanding that real war lay ahead. But mainly, he wrote about his love for Rose, about plans for the future, about how they would live after the war. In February 1944, a letter appeared that made me reread it several times. My darling Rose, I received your letter with the amazing news. I cried with joy right there in the barracks, and the guys thought I'd been wounded. Our baby. I can't believe we're going to be parents. I know you're scared right now. I know your parents are angry. But please, hold on. This will all be over soon, and we'll get married. I'll be the best husband and father in the world, I promise. Pregnancy. So Grandma Rose had a child by James. But where was that child? Mom was born in 1945, after the war. Could I have had an uncle or aunt whose existence I never knew about? The March 1944 letters were full of plans. James wrote about what they'd name the baby, what nursery furniture they'd buy, how he'd teach his son or daughter everything he knew. He even sent money, all his army savings, so Rose could buy what she needed for the baby. In April, the tone of the letters changed. James was preparing for a secret operation whose details he couldn't reveal. He wrote about love, about how much he missed her, about plans for the future. But between the lines, you could read his understanding that something terrible and dangerous lay ahead. The last letter was dated May 30th, 1944. My beloved Rose, tomorrow we're heading to where we've talked about for so long. I can't say where, but you'll understand from the news. If something happens to me, know this: you are the only one I ever loved. Take care of our little one. Tell him about me when he grows up. Tell him that Daddy loved him more than life, even though I never got to see him. Yours forever, James. D-Day, June 6th, 1944. I knew this date from history books, but I never thought it was connected to my family. And then, silence. No more letters. What happened to James? Did he die in that terrible battle on the French coast? I sat on the dusty attic floor, holding these witnesses to an old love, and realized I'd stumbled onto a family secret. Now many things became clear. Why Grandma never smiled in photographs. Why there was always some sadness in our house that nobody explained. And next day, I began my own investigation. First, I went to the Providence City Archives, the red brick building I remembered from childhood. I'd come here on a school field trip. Now I was searching here for answers to questions I hadn't even suspected then. Records of births, marriages, and deaths were kept in old leather volumes. It took me several hours of searching to find what I was looking for. Rose Cohen gave birth to a boy on November 15, 1944, at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Boston. The child's name was Robert. The father's name was not listed in the record, which was common practice for unmarried mothers. Robert. I'd never had an Uncle Robert. Mom was an only child. At least, that's what I'd been told all my life. The archivist, an elderly woman with kind eyes behind glasses, explained that in the 1940s, unmarried mothers almost always gave their children up for adoption, especially if the father was at war or missing in action. Adoption records were sealed for 75 years, but she suggested that information could sometimes be found in church records. At St. Patrick's Church, where my grandparents had once been married, Father O'Connell listened to my story with understanding. He checked the church records and confirmed my suspicions. Robert Cohen was baptized in their church in December 1944, and in February 1945 was given up for adoption to a family named Jenkins from Detroit, Michigan. The priest explained that in those days, children were often sent to distant cities, so biological parents couldn't find them and society wouldn't know about their origins. This was considered best for everyone. But the main question remained unanswered. What happened to James? I spent the whole evening online, studying military archives. James Patrick McCarthy, 101st Airborne Division, participated in the Normandy invasion on June 6, 1944, and there, in the dry lines of a military report, I found the answer. Private James Patrick McCarthy was killed on June 6, 1944, on Omaha Beach. He was 24 years old. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for rescuing wounded comrades under enemy fire. So he died on the very day he wrote about in his last letter. The Normandy invasion was his final operation. But did Rose ever learn about this? I returned to the attic and continued searching. In the same suitcase, under the letters, lay a thin notebook with a leather cover, a diary. On the first page in familiar handwriting, Rose Miller, 1946. Miller. So this was the diary of my already married grandmother. I opened it with a sinking heart. January 15th, 1947. A year and a half since I became Frank's wife. He's a good man, patient. He doesn't ask about what I don't want to talk about. Today Evelyn called him Daddy for the first time. My heart clenched. She'll never know she has an older brother somewhere in the world. What followed were entries about daily life, but between the lines you could read deep sadness. Rose wrote about how hard it was to pretend to be happy, how every morning she woke up thinking about James and Robert. March 3rd, 1947. Yesterday, I dreamed of James. He was holding the little boy and smiling. I woke up in tears. Frank asked what was wrong. I said I dreamed about my late mother. He believed me. He always believes. June 12th, 1947. 3 years ago today, James wrote me his last letter. Where is he now? Is he alive? Does he remember me? Frank noticed I was sad and brought me flowers. Such a sweet man. But how can I explain that part of me dies on this day every year? Gradually, a picture emerged from the entries. Frank Miller was a widower who had lost his wife to tuberculosis. He worked as a foreman at a textile factory, was 10 years older than Rose. Their parents had introduced them. More precisely, Rose's parents were looking for a reliable husband for their daughter who wouldn't ask too many questions. August 25th, 1947. Frank knows. Not everything, but the basics. My parents told him before the wedding that I'd had a youthful mistake, that I'd given birth to a child by a soldier who went missing in the war. Frank said it didn't matter, that the war had broken many lives, and people needed to help each other rebuild, missing in action. So Rose never learned the truth about James's death. Her parents decided not to tell her. Why cause even more pain? She lived her whole life with agonizing uncertainty, not knowing if James was alive, if he remembered her. October 10th, 1947. I understand why Frank agreed to this marriage. He's a lonely man who wants a family, and I'm a broken toy that will never work properly again. We suit each other. He gives me a roof over my head and respectability in society. I give him a quiet home and a daughter who will consider him her father. February 14th, 1950. Valentine's Day. Frank gave me jewelry. Beautiful, expensive. He tries to make me happy. But happiness can't be bought or given as a gift. It can only be lost. The last entry was dated 1952, June 6, 1952. 8 years since James's last letter came. Every year on this day, I go to church and light 2 candles. One for James's health, wherever he may be. The second for Robert's health. Frank thinks I'm praying for my dead parents. Let him think that. Some secrets must die with us. I closed the diary and sat for a long time in the attic's silence. Poor Grandma Rose. She carried this burden alone her whole life. A love that ended in tragedy. A child she had to give away. A loveless marriage built on mutual loneliness. And worst of all, She never learned that James died a hero rather than abandoning her. Where was Robert now? Was he alive? Did he know about his origins? Tracking his trail took several days. Robert Jenkins, born 1944, Detroit. Genealogy websites, databases, phone directories. Gradually, the life of a man I'd never known took shape before me. Robert had grown up in a working-class family in Detroit. His adoptive father worked at an auto plant. His mother was a housewife. He graduated high school, served in Vietnam, worked as a history teacher. Married in 1968, had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. Most importantly, he'd spent his whole life searching for information about his biological parents. In 1987, he filed an application with Michigan's Search Service. In 2010, he posted a notice on a website for adopted children, seeking information about biological parents. Robert, born November 15, 1944, in Boston. Adopted by Jenkins' family in Detroit in 1945. Only clue: silver St. Christopher medal, engraved R.C. J.M. 1942. My heart raced. Rose Cohen, James McCarthy. 1942, the year they met. The medal James gave Rose, which she placed in her newborn son's belongings as the only connection to his father. Robert Jenkins, now a 79-year-old retiree, lived in suburban Detroit with his wife, Dorothy. He had a large family, but questions about his origins had tormented him his whole life. Calling his number was frightening. What would I tell a man who'd spent his life searching for family? How could I explain that his father was a war hero and his mother had treasured his memory her whole life, not knowing about his death? A woman answered, Dorothy, Robert's wife. When I explained why I was calling, she called her husband. Robert's voice was soft, with a slight tremor of age. When I told him about the letters I'd found, about James and Rose, about the tragedy of 1944, silence fell on the other end of the line. Then Robert began to cry. He said he'd been waiting for this call for 79 years. We arranged to meet. I flew to Detroit a week later, bringing the letters, Grandma's diary, and all the documents I'd found. Robert met me at the airport, a tall, gray-haired man with a cane, wearing an elegant coat. Despite his age, he held himself straight, and there was dignity in his bearing. Seeing him, I immediately knew this really was my uncle. He had the same dark eyes as Grandma Rose, the same stubborn chin, the same graceful hands. The family resemblance was obvious. We hugged right there in the airport, 2 strangers connected by a tragic love story. Robert wept without shame, and I felt something important falling into place in my family history. On the drive to his house, we cautiously got to know each other. Robert talked about his life, childhood in Detroit, adoptive parents who loved him dearly, service in Vietnam, his teaching career. I talked about Mom, about my children, about how I'd accidentally found the letters in the attic. Robert's house was a cozy 1-story building in a quiet suburb. Dorothy met us at the door, a small woman with kind eyes and gray hair. She'd prepared lunch and set the table with her best china, as if she were receiving the most precious guests. We spent the whole day examining the letters and diary. Robert read messages from the father he'd never known, and tears never stopped flowing down his cheeks. For the first time in his life, he held something that had belonged to the people who gave him life. Each letter revealed new details. Robert learned that his father loved reading poetry, dreamed of his own construction company, played the harmonica. That his mother was an intelligent, educated girl who worked at a defense plant during the war and dreamed of a large family. When I showed him the diary entries where Grandma wrote about him, Robert was quiet for a long time. He was especially moved by the entry where Rose wrote about lighting a candle for his health every year. "She remembered me," he whispered. "She remembered me her whole life." Then Robert showed me his most precious relic. In an old jewelry box on the dresser lay a tiny silver St. Christopher medal, patron saint of travelers. A note in childish handwriting was attached. "Found in my blanket when I was little. Mama Jenkins said this was the only thing I had from my real parents." On the back of the medal was engraved, R.C. J.M. 1942. Rose Cohen, James McCarthy. Now everything fell into place. James had given Rose the medal before shipping out to the front, and when Robert was born, she placed an identical medal in his belongings, the only connection to the father he would never see. We talked until late into the night, reconstructing the events of 1944-1945. Robert told me about his life with the Jenkins family. They were simple, good people. Jacob worked at the Ford auto plant. Mary was a housewife. They'd been childless for a long time, and Robert's arrival was a gift from fate. They never hid that he was adopted, but they didn't know the details of his background. All the adoption agency told them was that his mother was a young, unmarried woman, and his father was missing in action in the war. Robert grew up surrounded by love and care, but questions about his biological parents tormented him his whole life. He imagined his mother in hundreds of different ways, young and old, rich and poor, happy and unhappy. Sometimes he was angry at her for giving him away. Sometimes he pitied her, understanding how hard it must have been for a young woman to raise a child alone in the 1940s. As a teenager, he rebelled, demanding information from his adoptive parents that they didn't have. At 20, he began searching on his own, but all archives were closed. At 30, he became a father himself and felt how painful the decision to give up a child must have been. When adoption laws changed in the 1980s, he was one of the first to file an application to search for his biological parents. But by then, the trail had gone cold. Too many years had passed. Too many documents were lost or sealed. And now, at 79, he finally had answers to all his questions. He learned his parents' names, their love story, the reasons he was given up for adoption. Most importantly, he understood that he wasn't abandoned, but given away out of love so he could have a better life. Robert's children, James, Rose, and Daniel, came to meet me the next day. He'd named them after his biological parents without even knowing their real names. Somehow these names just seemed right to him. James Jr. was a copy of his grandfather, tall, with blue eyes and an infectious laugh. Rose had inherited the dark eyes and delicate features of her grandmother. Daniel was like Robert himself, calm, thoughtful, with kind eyes. They'd all spent years listening to their father's stories about searching for his biological family. Now that the mystery was solved, they felt relief. Finally, their father had the answers he'd been seeking his whole life. Robert's grandchildren also came to meet their new relative. 7 children, aged 8 to 25, each with their own personality and talents. The most amazing discovery was the youngest granddaughter, Emily Rose. At 16, she was a talented pianist, though no one in the Jenkins family was musical. Now it became clear where this gift came from. From Grandma's diary, I learned that Rose played piano in the church choir and dreamed of becoming a professional pianist. The war destroyed these plans, but the talent passed through generations to a great-granddaughter who never knew her great-grandmother existed. A month later, we organized a large family reunion in Providence. Robert came to the city where he was born for the first time. All his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren came with him, almost 30 people. We began with a tour of places connected to Rose and James's story. The house on Hope Street where Rose lived now belonged to other people, but the owners let us stand nearby and take photos. The waterfront where the lovers walked had barely changed in 80 years. At St. Patrick's Church, Father O'Connell showed us the record of Robert's baptism. At the archives, we found documents about his birth and adoption. Each discovery was another piece of the family history puzzle. But the most moving moment was visiting the cemetery. Rose is buried next to Frank Miller at Swan Point Cemetery. A simple gray granite stone with the inscription, Rose Miller, 1922 to 2005, loving wife and mother. Robert stood for a long time at the grave of the woman who bore him, but whom he'd never seen. Then he took white roses from his pocket, the very flowers his mother was named for. "Mom," he whispered, laying the flowers on the grave, "I came to say thank you for the life you gave me, for the difficult decision you made, for the love you kept in your heart." We stood around the grave, a large family reunited after 80 years of separation. Children played on the cemetery paths where their great-grandmother once walked. Adults shared family stories with each other, finding common traits of character and appearance. After the cemetery, we went to the Rhode Island Military Museum. There, in the hall dedicated to World War II, we found information about the 101st Airborne Division and the Normandy invasion. The display case had photographs of paratroopers before their departure for France, but the faces in the military photos were too blurry to make out James. But in the museum archives, we found the list of posthumous awards. James Patrick McCarthy, Silver Star for Heroism in Combat. Brief description of his deed. Risking his own life, he carried 4 wounded comrades out from under enemy fire. Killed while performing a rescue operation on Omaha Beach. Robert read these lines aloud, and his voice trembled with pride. His father was a hero, a man who sacrificed his life for others. This knowledge healed the old pain of not having a father. Now he had a story to be proud of. That evening we gathered at a restaurant on the waterfront, the very place where Rose and James once walked. At the large table sat the descendants of their love, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. The story that began with a dance in 1942 continued in the faces and voices of new generations. During dinner, I told everyone about finding the letters, about my search, about Grandma's diary. Robert shared memories of his childhood, about how he always felt that somewhere there was his real family. The children asked questions about the great-grandmother and great-grandfather they'd never seen. We showed them photographs, read excerpts from letters, told the story of a love interrupted by war. The most touching was the story of Robert's granddaughter, Emily Rose. She said she'd always dreamed of learning more about her roots, about where her musical talent came from. Now she understood. It was a gift from her great-grandmother Rose, who had also dreamed of a musical career. Emily Rose played in the Youth Symphony Orchestra and was preparing to apply to conservatory. Now she decided to dedicate her talent to her great-grandmother's memory. Her thesis would be called Letters of War, a musical composition inspired by the story of Rose and James. We agreed to meet every year on the anniversary of their first meeting. In summer, when the roses bloom in Providence, our families would come here to remember the love story that united us all. 6 months have passed since I found those letters in the attic. Robert moved closer to his children in Boston, and we see each other often. He finally got what he'd been searching for his whole life: knowledge of his roots, understanding of who he was and where he came from. I began writing a book about our family, about love that survived war, death, and decades of separation, about a woman who kept a secret in her heart her whole life, about a man who died a hero, protecting other people's lives, about a child who grew up not knowing his parents, but carrying their best qualities within him. I also understood important things about my own family, about why Mom was always a little sad. She grew up feeling her mother's sadness, but not understanding its cause. About why there was always a special atmosphere in our house. The memory of unfulfilled love hung in the air, even when no one spoke of it. Mom died never learning the truth about her older brother, but I told this story to my children and grandchildren. They should know that their roots reach not only into peaceful post-war America, but into the heroic era of people who loved, fought, and sacrificed themselves for the future. On my desk now stand 3 framed photographs. One shows young Rose and James, which I found among the letters, happy and in love in 1942. The second shows Robert with his family on the day of our first meeting. The third shows our entire large family on the Providence waterfront in the place where this story began. Love really is stronger than time and death. Rose and James couldn't be together, but their love united 2 large families 80 years later. Their son, whom they never saw, grew up to be a worthy man and raised wonderful children. A story that began with tragedy ended with reunion. And this is perhaps the most beautiful ending this wartime love story could have had. Every time I reread those yellowed letters, I think about how many similar stories our families hold. How many secrets, joys, tragedies are hidden in old boxes in attics, in forgotten diaries, in random notes. And how important it is not to let these stories disappear, because in the end, we are all the continuation of someone's love story. And our task is to find these stories, preserve them, and pass them on, so future generations know where they came from and who loved before them. Rose and James' story reminded me that even the most tragic love can bear fruit across decades, that children born from love carry it within them their whole lives, even if they never knew their parents, that families can reunite in the most unexpected ways if you don't lose hope and keep searching. This story also taught me to value what I have: my family, my children, the ability to know my roots. Not everyone has such luxury. Robert lived almost 80 years not knowing who his parents were. But when the truth was revealed, it brought not only answers to old questions, but a new family, new connections, new meaning to life. Sometimes the most important discoveries await us in the most unexpected places. In dusty boxes in the attic, in old letters, in forgotten diaries. You just need the courage to open those boxes and the readiness to accept the truth, whatever it might be. My family's story changed forever on that October day when I climbed up to Mom's attic. What began as simple cleanup after a funeral turned into a journey through time that united people separated by war and circumstances. And now, when I look at photographs of our large reunited family, I understand. Rose and James' love didn't go to waste. It lives in each of us, in every child who bears their names, in every melody Emily Rose plays, in every story we tell about them. This is true immortality, not in monuments or memorials, but in the lives of people who continue our story. In love that passes from generation to generation, even when we don't realize it, Rose never learned that James died a hero on D-Day. She lived her whole life thinking he was somewhere far away, possibly with a new family. This uncertainty was agonizing, but it allowed her to keep a grain of hope. Now their story has received a worthy ending. Robert knows the truth about his parents. Emily Rose plays music in memory of her great-grandmother. And we all carry within us a piece of that great love that began with a dance in distant 1942. Last month, I received a letter from a young woman in Oregon. She read my story online and wrote that she, too, had found old letters in her late grandmother's house. Now she's searching for descendants of a soldier who wrote to her grandmother during the Korean War. There turned out to be many such stories. War separated thousands of lovers, scattered families across the world. But love finds ways to reunite people, even across decades. Robert often says that the most valuable thing about our discovery isn't the answers to old questions, but understanding that he was loved his whole life. That somewhere a woman lit a candle for him every year. That his father died a hero, saving others. That he was given up for adoption not from unwillingness, but from desperation and love. Recently, Robert and I went to Washington, to the World War II Memorial. We found James McCarthy's name on the wall of memory. Robert stood before those letters for a long time, touching them with his fingers. His father was no longer just a name in documents. He had become part of the country's history. And Emily Rose was accepted to Juilliard School of Music in New York. Her composition, Letters of War, received a scholarship as the best work of the year. In the concert program, she wrote, "Dedicated to my great-grandmother Rose Cohen and great-grandfather James McCarthy, whose love survived war and time." Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I hadn't gone up to that attic, if I hadn't opened the old suitcase. Robert would have died, never knowing his roots. Emily Rose would play music without understanding where her gift came from. And the story of great love would have remained buried under the dust of oblivion. But fate decided otherwise. Love found a way to announce itself after 80 years, and now it lives in new generations, in new names, in new hopes. Next week, I'm flying to Detroit for Robert's grandson's wedding. The young man is marrying a girl also named Rose. Whether this is coincidence or a sign doesn't matter. What matters is that the story continues. And in my house in Providence, in that very attic where I found the letters, now sits a new suitcase. In it lie photographs of our meetings, copies of documents I've collected, recordings of interviews with Robert. Materials for future generations who will someday want to know their story. Because history doesn't end, it just passes from one generation to another, from one love to another. And our task is to preserve these stories so they don't disappear in the dust of time. Rose and James couldn't live their lives together, But their love proved stronger than death, stronger than time, stronger than all the circumstances that separated them. It united families, gave meaning to an elderly man's life, inspired a young girl's music. And this is probably love's main secret. It doesn't disappear with the passing of those who loved. It remains to live in those who come after. In every child born from love, in every story told with warmth, in every letter written with tenderness. Letters from the past changed my life. They reminded me that the most important thing in life is the connections between people. Love, family, memory of those who came before us. These connections make us who we are. They give us roots and wings at the same time. And someday, many years from now, one of my descendants will climb up to the attic and find my suitcase with the story of Rose and James. And this story will continue because true love never dies. It just waits for its moment to announce itself to the world again.